Let's talk about how I took my Ficus Fiddle Leaf Fig from this to this in 3 years. What is up, guys? My name is Lithius and welcome to Roots Ready. The Ficus Fiddle Leaf Fig, an infamous plant for many reasons, and not all of them are good, I'm sure you will know. I got this plant during the pandemic when my plant collection really started to grow and explode. And this was a plant at the time I think was considered a staple plant. It was one of those ones that everybody wanted to have. Interestingly, I think I bought this plant on Amazon of all places. I've only bought maybe 2 or 3 plants from Amazon. This one, my Monstera deliciosa, and another that I can't remember now. But in that time, boy oh boy, has this plant grown and grown and grown. And I've learned so much along that journey, and I'm here to share it with you. So yes, this is the Fiddle Leaf Fig, and oh my god, this plant has done quite a lot of growing for me in a very relatively short space of time. In fact, it's kind of getting a bit too tall, a bit too wobbly, and I think it might be time for a bit of notching to sort of get this plant to branch out a little bit, but that's probably a project for another day. As I said, I've had this plant for 3 years and I got it as a very small cutting. I recall this plant being just a handful of leaves. I first got this plant thinking it was going to be the larger leaf variety, but then I realized that I actually ordered the Bambino version, and that probably was the best thing for me because I've seen those plants and they grow to absolute giants, and my space is relatively tight and compact, and you need something a bit like this to sort of be able to fit into the environment without taking over and requiring too much care and too much sunlight and resources just to sort of keep it alive. So in hindsight, I'm quite glad that I got this one. I'm getting to experience the Fiddle Leaf Fig life without compromising on space. So all in all, it worked out well. I think I'm qualified to talk about the growth of this plant because I've grown it in a few ways. I first got this plant, it was obviously growing in soil, and I remember taking the plant out of soil and growing it in semi-hydro. At the time I was growing it in Lechuza pond, and the plant did really well. It actually grew most of its height in Lechuza pond. However, winter came and it spelt almost the death of this plant, because when I was growing this plant, I was still quite relatively new to growing plants in semi-hydro. I hadn't really experienced growing them in winter. So this plant actually taught me a lot about that. I remember growing this plant, and when the temperatures dropped really, really low, obviously I still had it in a reservoir, and because it got so cold, the plant really started to drop quite a lot of leaves. They started to go black around the base, and I lost quite a number of them. And when I noticed that, this was probably one of the first plants that I moved back into soil, and that's when our good friends at Soil Ninja came in and provided some really good, well-draining soil that this plant has been in for a while now, so maybe about a year or so. And even then, the plant just continues to grow. Look at the thick, bushy growth that this plant has produced in that time. Speaking of growth, this plant is very particular, and I think this is the reason why so many of us really struggle to grow this plant in our homes, because this plant needs consistency. That's the name of the game of this plant. It's consistency. I've noticed that whenever I miss a watering period, or if I slightly overwater my plant, that's when for me it will stop producing new leaves and maybe start dropping 1 or 2 lower down to the base. So being really, really consistent with this plant really is what's going to get you success, and that's consistency with everything. I mentioned watering, but I hear you asking, how often do you water this plant? For me, I actually put this plant on a schedule of once a week. So I'll come in, I'll give it a good little bit of a drink, not too much to really soak and saturate the soil, but a good amount to sort of get half the pot a bit moist. Because this plant is sitting in a glazed terracotta pot, it doesn't have the same wicking power as a regular terracotta pot, so that means it holds on to moisture a lot more. I'm trying to keep that soil at a regular level of moisture throughout the week. So again, I'm going in just a little bit of water, just trying to get this plant to a sort of a half sort of level of moisture, let it come down a little bit, not to completely bone dry, and then bring it back up and just keep it in that range. And that has worked well for me so far. Of course, in the winter, you want to look at that watering a lot closer. I've noticed that with this plant, it completely stops growing in the winter. Again, consistency, that's the key here. Because there's less light, the days are shorter, and the plant is using less of the water, you obviously then have to adjust your watering to reduce that. So I'm going from once a week to maybe once every 2 weeks at this point with my Fiddle Leaf Fig. Because that consistency and that level isn't quite there, the plant absolutely stops growing in my experience. these right here, these are the first leaves that this plant has produced for me in months. So since the start of winter, maybe even late autumn, the plant has stopped growing and hasn't done a thing. And now that we have a bit of sun, we have a few leaves growing on this plant just here. So that shows me that the plant is ready to rock and roll. And when it gets that consistency and the levels just right, it's gonna take off. It really, really is. It's gonna have unstoppable growth until the weather changes again. In the growing season, I actually tend to fertilize this plant every watering. And I know some people probably do a bit of a half dosage and stuff like that. I actually just give it the full dose, and that seems to be working well, because my thing is that the plant is growing so much. It's working on 3 leaves at the moment, and there's another one that's about to emerge. So that's 4 leaves at a time. So the plant needs as much energy as it can get. So I tend to sort of do the fertilizing like that, and then in the winter I cut that all the way back to 0 because the plant again isn't growing. I'm not going to saturate the soil with nutrients that the plant isn't using. All that's going to do is just create a really kind of toxic environment for the roots, and that can really damage the plant. So you want to be careful with that. With lighting, you want to give this plant as much light as you can. I have this plant sat in front of my east facing window, and I tend not to move it around too much. I feel like if you move this plant a foot in either direction, it's gonna notice that there's something changed. I'm sure that because I've moved this plant for the purpose of this video today, it's gonna have some kind of an impact on the plant. I'm gonna try to put it back in a very similar position to where it was before, but I'm sure that's gonna have an impact. Honestly, you move this plant just a little bit, any direction, and the plant will almost panic. So for as much as possible, try to find a spot for this plant that you're just gonna set it and forget it. I found this plant to be quite resilient. I haven't had any pest issues with this. Only once, I think there was a slug in my soil, and that was it. I found a slug. I think it came from outside. I'm hoping I don't have like a slug situation in the house, because that would be, I'd have to get on that quite quickly. But even then, there was no damage to the leaves. I don't think these leaves are so solid that I think a slug or a snail would have a very hard time biting into this. And I'm pretty sure that's probably a similar reason why I don't have any issues with spider mites, which is sort of the main pest that I sort of deal with here. I haven't had to deal with them for a while. Fingers crossed that remains that way. But even then, this plant is right next to my euphorbia, which consistently comes down with spider mites. One of the first plants to sort of get it, and this plant is unfazed by that. So quite a solid, quite a resilient plant as well. What I like about this plant, I should mention, is that it gives you these signals when things are not right or when things have changed in its care. So you can see we have consistent growth. All the leaves are sort of very similar. And then you get to a leaf like this, which is substantially smaller than the others. And then you realize that something went wrong here. I'm not sure what this is. Maybe this was the start of winter. So you can see we had a few nice leaves. So this one is a decent size. This one came after. This one is a little bit smaller, but maybe that was the first signs of change. And then this one came out, and the plant was like, yo, something's not right here. I don't like this. It tried to put out a new branch here that has since died. But you can see, like, things like this, you can see there's another example lower down. Again, that smaller leaf. Lots of good solid leaves beforehand, and then it just starts to sort of reduce the leaf size until it eventually stops, and you get this massive internodal space like we have between this tiny baby leaf and this one over here. So I wouldn't refer to it as a fussy plant necessarily, although it, some might consider it so. I would consider it a plant that communicates through its actions or lack thereof. Yeah, so this is the Fiddle Leaf Fig, an incredible 3-year journey, and I can't wait to see what the future holds for this plant. I think the next big thing is going to be getting some branches and getting a nice bushy plant rather than it growing non-stop to the heavens and back. So this is it. This is my update on the Ficus Fiddle Leaf Fig. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, keep planting.